listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hi, my name is Bárbara Mendes-Jorge, and I am a sustainability communications expert based in Brussels, Belgium. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Let's Talk Sustainable Business, a series brought to you by the Conference Board. A quick note before we get onto this interview. At time of recording, George Harding-Rolls worked on fashion, plastics and circular economy at Changing Markets Foundation. He is now Director of Advocacy at EcoAge and Fossil Fuel Fashion Campaign Lead. Today is the first of a two-part episode with George Harding-Rolls, Fashion, Plastics and Circular Economy at Changing Markets Foundation and greenwash.com. So the theme for this episode is how greenwashing can impact your company's reputation and finances. Greenwashing regulation continues ramping up worldwide with huge consequences for businesses in Europe and across the world. Climate change-related lawsuits doubled globally in the last 7 years. Consumers are increasingly registering greenwashing complaints, and a recent Chartered Institute of Management study found that 63% of consumers are skeptical of brand sustainability efforts. So in this two-part episode, we'll be exploring why greenwashing continues to happen and what companies can do to spot and avoid it. Our guest, George Harding-Rolls, works on the fashion, plastics and circular economy sectors at the Changing Markets Foundation, an organisation creating and supporting campaigns that shift market share away from unsustainable products and companies towards environmentally and socially beneficial solutions. Changing Market Foundations has a number of reports related to greenwashing, including false promise of certification, license to greenwash, and feeding us greenwash. George also set up greenwash.com, a website and platform which helps consumers recognize the variety of tactics the companies use to greenwash and reveal the scale of the problem, with a view to demonstrate the vital need for better greenwashing regulation and higher standards for businesses. So welcome, George, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So how have you seen sustainability communications and therefore greenwashing develop over the last decade?
Yeah, so I've been working in sustainability for over 10 years. And when I started, I was actually living out in China when I kind of first started working in this sector, working for a law firm, taking on clients to sort of help them with their CSR strategy as a way to kind of influence the government's opinion of foreign businesses working in China. So it was a really kind of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You know, you do some CSR projects here and we'll kind of smooth the runway of your operations in the country. So it was really the start of it, you know, in that CSR world where they're just niche projects. You're getting on with business as usual as a company and then engaging in some sort of niche side projects. When I moved back to the UK, I started working for an NGO called Forum for the Future. And I remember great excitement. This must have been about 8 years or so ago. Great excitement when a major UK supermarket started talking about climate change in a kind of public facing context. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is going to change everything. Suddenly businesses are taking on this mandate of big environmental, social problems as part of their kind of core business strategy. But what we've seen in the intervening years is really a lot of that has just been talk. Now you can barely find a business that doesn't talk about climate change, that doesn't talk about ESG or other related issues. And what we know is that the situation hasn't really got any better, and that promise of businesses of the corporate sector delivering systemic change has really fallen flat.
Yeah, it's interesting that you first came from it from a legal standpoint as well, because I think that's how it's increasingly being seen as a risk factor for that. You mentioned ESG, so how do you feel about the fact that ESG factors are becoming increasingly popular for investors, and how do you feel companies are reacting to that?
Yeah, so I mean, I take my lead in terms of my thoughts on this from Tariq Fancy, who used to be a head of sustainable investing at BlackRock, and then left that and became a very, very vocal critic of ESG in a 3-part Diary of a Sustainable Investor, which I recommend everybody read online. And he's immensely critical of ESG, as am I. I think it is a next bastion of greenwashing. I think it is a very, very convenient way for the financial services sector to show that they are doing something about ESG issues, about sustainability, without really changing the rules of the game that much, and without really being able to demonstrate any real impact for their ESG efforts. I think it's in a similar way to the rest of greenwashing, whether it's in a kind of consumer-facing way with the products we buy, or through financial services, or through other services like travel. it's a way to take that consumer anxiety and take, we're literally seeing people on the streets protesting daily about the slow rate of change, to take that anxiety, to take that kind of activist momentum, particularly amongst millennials, and to turn that into profit. So to say, hey, why don't you put your money into an ESG tracker fund or something like that, even though there is very little demonstrable evidence that that is changing the state of play. Some of the companies you see listed as like ESG investments, it's like Exxon. It's ridiculous. It's very, very easy for a couple of metrics to be put onto a company's listing profile to make them ESG compliant or make them possible to list on an ESG index, without that actually creating any systemic change. And so what we need really is regulation at a higher level, in terms of, we don't really have a definition for what ESG is that's accepted across different jurisdictions. It's mostly a kind of being made, the rules of the game are being made by the players of the game rather than the rules of the game being made by the referee, so to speak, or any kind of government or policymakers.
So how do you feel about the ramping up of regulation in the EU, with the Green Claims Directive and other things? Do you think that's a positive step forward? Is it still lacking? What ultimately kind of, how do we move then beyond greenwashing and ESG light?
Yes, yeah, I love the term ESG light. I think that's great. So what we've been seeing with the Green Claims Directive in the EU is the latest of a series of pieces of regulation to be proposed across the world. A lot of it is an interpretation of existing consumer law, and kind of competition law. So in the UK, we have the Competition and Markets Authority, who are really spearheading the work to push against greenwashing, starting with fashion sector and consumer goods companies. And then the Green Claims Directive was a kind of long heralded piece of policy to come in. It's going through the motions. There's a lot of different, back and forth that it needs to go through different EU institutions. So far, some of the promising things have been that since the EU Commission's proposal for the Green Claims Directive, when it then went through Parliament in the first round, they increased the ambition of it by asking that, or voting that amendments are included to push back against climate neutral, carbon neutral, net zero claims as generic claims. That shouldn't be allowed, essentially, which is in line with some of the things that the UN has recommended in their net zero integrity report around COP last year, essentially saying that, yeah, it's fine for you guys to do carbon offsetting as companies, but it shouldn't count towards your decarbonisation plans. It should be a kind of nice to have, but not where you're putting, the basket in which you're putting all your eggs. So yeah, I think it's really promising that there's this regulatory shift. And the US will hopefully follow up with changing its Federal Trade Commission guidelines, green code. They're all called different things. I can't remember which one that one's called. But yeah, we're seeing this sort of sea change of regulation, and that brings in this risk factor that it's no longer, the greenwashing is no longer a kind of marketing only thing. There's actually some real risk there. There's a real regulatory risk to companies who aren't compliant.
Yeah, you touched base on this, and it makes me think of the Carbon Market Watch report that also talked about net zero. Those terms like net zero, like circular economy, are becoming more mainstream. And do you think it's helping or hindering? It sounded like you're implying that companies are hiding behind these terms, and this is what the Carbon Market Watch report found as well. That emissions, the companies are claiming to reduce so much lower than in reality, and they're far too reliant on carbon offsetting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think carbon offsetting is it's been likened to indulgences in the church. Paying to offset your sins,
Yeah.
paying for somebody else to take the heat for your lack of ambition or lack of progress on decarbonisation. So yeah, I mean, it's great that it's come to light that it will come to light in the kind of mainstream narrative that carbon offsets are a very, very unreliable way to offset your emissions. Particularly kind of carbon cycle based ones, which, we saw the wildfires of last year and the year before, which took out most of the carbon offsets of like BP and Microsoft. And it shows just in a changing climate just how fragile a resource of carbon offsetting that is. So, it's not to say that there is not a place for carbon sequestration. It's super important that we continue those efforts, but it shouldn't be the primary mode that companies are using to greenwash their image. And I think in terms of other buzzwords, sustainability buzzwords like circularity in particular, that's a huge thing in the fashion industry right now. And I think, again, it lacks definition. Everybody's going to define it in a different way. Some of the major fashion brands will define turning plastic bottles into recycled polyester as circular, even though it is the opposite of circular, because actually you're taking them from a circular bottle to bottle recycling system and you're turning them into fiber, which is a one-way ticket to landfill because you cannot recycle it again. So the definitions really, really vary. And I think they're just part of this arsenal of greenwashing buzzwords that marketing teams in many companies have just latched onto over the last kind of 2 to 5 years as being a way to tap into this resource of climate anxious consumers that you can persuade to buy your products by making them seem a little bit greener. But it's not changing anything at a fundamental level, and actually it is distracting us from the change that does need to happen.
You mentioned marketing there, and I think that is part of it, because my next question for you is, do you think that most companies are greenwashing intentionally or unintentionally? I know it's a big question with many factors, but I'd be curious to see from your experience how you feel about that.
I think it's very intentional. I think it's either fully intentional or it's woefully incompetent. If you are putting out that kind of marketing, that kind of those kind of slogans, those kind of buzzwords, and you are not fully aware of what that's doing at a wider level in terms of creating confusion, in terms of I think, put it this way, it's so easy to attach the buzzword. It's so hard to actually prove it, and it's so hard to actually do the work to make sure that it is genuinely a lower impact product, or genuinely something that contributes to the circular economy. And if they were really doing that effort, that hard work, they would be talking about it way more and in so much more detail in order to outcompete the others who are just using the buzzwords. So it's almost like the less they're saying, the more you know that it is actually greenwash. I think it's fully intentional. I think it's been, as I said before, a strategy in order to tap into that green money from a lot of consumers, and a way to outcompete others who are not talking in that way. But it is really coming back to bite now. And I think, so the way that I often talk about greenwashing and why it's a bad thing is, firstly, that it misleads consumers. That's quite an obvious one to get your head around. The second one is that it's actually anti-competitive. So if you have one company that is truly making an effort and substantiating everything, using certification where it's legitimate, going the extra mile to make sure that the claims they're putting on the market are legitimate, and then another company that is just using those buzzwords, that is just deeply unfair, and that needs to be corrected. But then the third reason that greenwashing is bad, and needs to be tackled, and it's the kind of most wide lens element, is that it acts as a smokescreen. It blinds us to the level of change that we actually need to make in order to avoid climate collapse. And it blinds us to the solutions that we need to take. So what greenwashing is relying on marketing, relying on companies voluntarily to be shifting towards a more sustainable economy. What we actually need is a change to the rules of the game. We need legislative solutions. We need systemic solutions. And greenwashing makes us think that companies have the answer, when actually it's my firm belief that policy has the answer.
Interesting. I will say that I do have some sympathy for kind of marketing and communications teams, because I feel like sometimes they are pressurized to talk about things in a sustainable way and don't have the technical knowledge. And if there isn't that kind of catch safe to make sure that what they're saying is accurate, I think sometimes there's a bit of tension. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think I'll agree that a lot of them are doing it intentionally, but sometimes I think it is the structure of the company and where the pressure is coming from, as you say, to be sustainable, whether it is because your competitors are being seen to do it, or because Generation Z is now, they're becoming adults and they're more likely to open up their money. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I
it's
think that also like points to a recommendation, I guess, is I've seen it as well with companies where their sustainability department and their marketing department are just not talking to each other at
yeah.
all. Maybe they get a little bit of a briefing on what the company is doing on sustainability, but they're not taught like actually how does that need to be legally compliant with
Mm-hmm.
consumer protection law or competition law. They're not joining up the dots in that way, and I think now that's probably less than it was a couple of years ago because there is the legal risk element. But I know for anyone listening where their marketing team is not talking to their sustainability team or not even part of the same system,
Mm-hmm.
that's a real red flag, and that's where you can fall into a greenwashing trap.
Yeah, agreed. So the way that we've been talking about sustainability and a lot of work that you do is very focused on environmental issues. And as someone who also works in sustainability, what I find interesting is that people do just link sustainability to environment, and sometimes at the most basic level, carbon emissions. Like if we deal with carbon emissions, we're tackling climate change and it's fine. So how do you feel about the fact that companies very often do focus on that, and how do you think that companies are doing on social and governance? Because obviously with the ESRS compliance coming up, companies are going to have to report way more transparently on the social and governance, and I feel like a lot of them are focusing on very specific parts of the environment, but they're not aware of the tsunami that's coming of social and governance disclosure.
Yeah, no, totally. I think it is. You're right. There's this sort of environmental or the E myopia where you forget the S and the G.
Mm-hmm.
Insofar as ESG is a good metric, but I think it comes from there's a traditional core to the sustainability or environmental sector, and people who've been working it for a long time, and I've seen it in a lot of people that I come across where yeah, they're keen to keep it as an environmental focused thing or even a climate focused thing. I think it's partially because it becomes so much harder when you've got to make it a just transition. And it's the right thing to do 100%. But sometimes the solutions from an environmental perspective that people have been pushing on very, very heavily, when you add the S in there, let alone the G in there, it becomes a lot harder just becomes a lot more of a kind of gray area. But we absolutely have to tackle those issues as well. We absolutely have to look at things through a lens of climate justice from a just transition as well. Otherwise, who are we creating this new world for? Are we
Mm-hmm.
creating it for, it's a very global north centric perspective, I think, to look at it from just an environmental perspective, to kind of sort out the climate, make the planet livable,
Plant some
and then,
trees, reduce some
yeah,
emissions, sorted.
exactly. And it's all going to be a beautiful kind of eco steampunk future. Um, but the economies, the emerging economies that are rightfully saying, you've had your time in the sun, it's time for us as well. That is a very difficult tension to manage. If we're talking about shortening supply chains in the fashion industry, for example, moving production out of countries in, for example, South Asia, traditionally massive manufacturing hubs for textiles, that has to be managed in a just way. And the fact is that the status quo that we have now, business as usual, is not just, we're barely paying people a living wage across the supply chain, certainly talking about fashion. So there's a hugely long way to go. And I think, but just because it's difficult to do and just because it makes things, it kind of muddies the water from an environmental perspective, doesn't mean that it shouldn't be engaged in. And I think that's where we need to see companies taking leadership on it. Not so that it becomes social washing, but so that they are there at the table advising policymakers on how it can be done in the correct way, but obviously not from a kind of lobbying for the status quo. As you say, there's lots of legislation coming down the pipeline that is going to make this mandatory, and I think that is the one to watch.
You mentioned social washing. Do you see an increase in that happening as well with companies?
Do I see that happening?
Or have you seen that in the companies that you're monitoring, or do you think that's around the corner? Because my next question to you was actually going to be what social and governance issues do you see taking precedence over the next decade? So obviously you mentioned supply chain issues. I'm thinking also kind of conflict minerals and things like that. But yeah, what issues are you seeing, and what issues do you think are going to be the most pertinent ones in the future?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely a lot of social washing going on. I think it's not been the area of focus for me in terms of like scrutinizing companies on that. There's a lot of it in terms of ambient social washing, in the way you have ambient greenwashing, which is use of nice green imagery, forests, that sort of thing. You do get a lot of social washing in, again, particularly in the fashion sector, from um, garment workers in a nice clean factory, and we know that that's not likely to be the case, and that's probably stock imagery, but it just helps to add to this ambient sense that this company is headed in the right direction, or is indeed right now fully investing in its supply chain workers. Again, I think the most important thing is that these things become mandatory and not just a case of it looks good for your marketing. So where you, for example, in the green claim side, to make a green claim, it has to be fully substantiated through a third party organization, and then through things like due diligence, like corporate sustainability due diligence directive in the EU, that these things become mandatory to report on and to be transparent about, so it's easier to take action, and then it doesn't become a competitive advantage to start social washing or to start greenwashing. It actually becomes just something you're required to do by law.
Yeah, the communications company Radley Yelder call that stock sustainability. The images of nature and lots of green, and yeah, I'm sure the social one. I'm guessing it's lots of happy children and
Yeah.
workers looking happy. So yeah, look out for that in future.
I had an old job where I used to do a lot of slide decks for the CEO, and I went away on holiday for one period, and I used to be quite stringent on like the type of imagery that I used for it, and tried to make it less about green trees and polar bears and things like that. And then I went away, and an intern took over just for one slide deck, and there was like full of like two cupped hands with a seedling in it, and like a lovely earth and lots of trees and flowers and things like that. I was like, I know you're doing your best, but come on, we've got to move on from this.
Listeners, I am nodding in agreement as someone who's worked in sustainability since 2010. Thanks for joining me for part 1, George. See you in part 2.
Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you to George for joining us today. And thanks to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to this podcast series and explore the entire catalogue of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcasts. See you next time.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.